Gossipnista here, your one and only source into the real lives of New Yorkers and what it's like to live in New York City. So is it all glitz and glamour? Where do you start? What should you know? And who am I? I'll tell you everything you need to know, and you'll thank me for it. XOXO Gossipnista. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Gossipnista podcast. I'm your host, Mariana Monks. Thanks for joining me. Today, we're talking an array of topics that pertain to New York City with entrepreneur and NYC lawyer Hal Coopersmith. But first, in my last episode, we talked wedding planning in New York with wedding planner Ashley Perino, who shares what you can expect should you be looking to get married in the city. So if you haven't tuned in, you can listen anytime on episode 18. This week, my guest, Hal Coopersmith, comes from 3 generations of the Big Apple. We talk tenant laws, which anyone renting in New York City should know about, why he added entrepreneurship to his resume and the software he developed for the real estate market. Plus, we dive deep into the state of New York businesses, remote work moving forward, and so much more. Be sure to tune in, rate, and review the podcast, and follow along at Gossipnista Podcast. Here is my interview with Hal Coopersmith. Hi, Hal. How are you? I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
It's great to be on the podcast, Mariana.
It's my pleasure. I am so interested in learning more about you, Hal, and I appreciate you being here. And the first question that I pretty much ask everyone coming on here, because it's a New York podcast, is, Hal, are you originally from New York? Are you a native?
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm surprised that you're interested in getting to know me more, but
Yes.
I am a native New Yorker. I was born in Manhattan on the Upper East Side.
Oh my gosh, I'm getting goosebumps here, Hal, because love that you're born in Manhattan and I live on the Upper East Side. So
Whereabouts?
So I'm in the Lenox Hill area.
Yeah, I'm in the Lenox Hill area too, so we're very close, but we didn't know that going into.
Oh my gosh. Wait, so you actually, which my next question falls into, okay, so you're a native, born New Yorker. Do you currently reside on the Upper East Side, or are you somewhere else?
I'm currently on the Upper East Side.
Wow, we did not know this. So we're neighbors. And so, what has your experience been like on the Upper East Side?
Well, I grew up there, and so going back to the Upper East Side, it's been a different experience. Some places are still around. There's a lot of change, as happens with New York City. But what's nice about the Upper East Side is that there are people that are there that I know, who I'm friendly with, and my family is still there. So that's been a great benefit for me, just to be close. And in New York City, even if you're a few blocks away, it can be a completely different neighborhood. So that's been nice as well.
Yeah, I really feel each, New York neighborhood has a different feel, and the Upper East Side definitely has its own feel. While I'm there, what would you say the Upper East Side feel is, Hal?
I would say it's very family oriented. And what's also nice is that there's a young vibe to it. There are a lot of bars on Second Avenue that appeal
Hmm.
to a younger crowd. So you get a nice mix of young energy and families.
Agreed, 100% agree. So overall, aside from the Upper East Side, how has your experience been growing up in New York, being a native New Yorker?
Well, I don't know anything different, so I can only speak to that it's been a phenomenal experience, and I don't know what it would be like to grow up anywhere else. And
Uh-huh.
certainly going to different places, I always wonder where the energy is, and like any good New Yorker, I would say it's hard to envision myself living anywhere else.
So you've never lived outside of New York?
Just for college.
Okay, good to know. And then so what essentially is it that you like about New York, Hal, and dislike about New York?
I knew you were going to ask that.
Of course.
I think, there's a lot to New York, but I think just the uniqueness and how you can certainly find anything that you're looking for in New York.
Mhm.
We talk about culture a lot, food, just energy and art, and I think that that's the best part of New York, and that it's just almost impossible to be bored in New York. And
Mhm.
so all those things to do are wonderful.
Mhm.
In terms of the negative side of New York, I think I'd probably be with a lot of other folks that it's certainly a high cost environment, so you have to be
Mhm.
prepared for that. But
Mhm.
in exchange, you do get a lot of wonderful things.
Yes, yes, and you did mention a lot of those on your likes, but given there's been a lot of change in the world and New York as of late, do you feel all those things you mentioned, the energy, the accessibility of maybe things being open and things along those lines, has it changed since COVID-19?
I mean, I have to say that that absolutely has changed a
Mm-hmm.
lot in terms of the energy, and if you're there, you absolutely have to agree with me on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think the larger focus is going to be what will New York's future look like.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond COVID-19, what happens in the fall and in the winter,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of people being able to congregate and how long isolation goes on, and what happens there. And so for us, or I should say, so for me, it's more just in terms of predicting what is what the future will look like
Mm-hmm.
on the other side of COVID-19.
And do you have any idea on what it will look like?
Well, everyone has an idea in terms of what it will look like, but I think that it'll be hard to imagine New York not returning to the way that it was, at
Mm-hmm.
least in my mind. It may take a while to get there, but I just think that there's too much going on, too much infrastructure, so that it does go completely barren. I think that there's too much at stake for New York
Right.
for it to disappear, and so it'll take a lot of work. It'll take maybe some time, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
a believer in New York returning. I'm a believer in office space, and I believe that for retail and what that environment looks like,
Mm-hmm.
that will that we'll figure out what to do with retail on the street, and obviously the arts and plays and culture, that certainly has to return, because I don't see it going anywhere else.
Good. Great. You're giving us some hope here, Hal. So that's good to hear, especially coming from a native. So like you said, it'll be a while, but you definitely see it coming back. I mean, you have been here through some of the most impactful times that New York has gone through. You're hearing this all over the news from 9/11 and Hurricane Sandy and various other things. Is this different? Just a little different? A lot different?
Well, everything's different. I mean, each circumstance I think is unique, and each impact that New York has kind of dealt through has been unique. Obviously, no two things are the same.
Hmm.
I think what will be different is how long it will take to to find a new normal, quote unquote, and
Hmm.
what that new normal looks like. And I'm sure there were certainly a lot of naysayers through a lot of the impacts, particularly September 11th,
Hmm.
and talking about how people would never go into a tall building again. But
Hmm.
here we are. So
Yeah,
I believe that people will be back in gyms and indoors and doing all things that we used to do before COVID.
perfect. All right, and we'll keep it at that. In the meantime, you're on the Upper East Side. You're a native New Yorker, born in Manhattan. Do you have any plans of leaving New York anytime soon? I mean, are you grounded here in New York?
I've been outside the city for a fair amount of time through COVID-19, because I'm a lawyer and I've been able to do my job remotely, and
Hmm.
fortunate that I have been able to find a place outside New York and
Hmm.
be able to go for runs, and so fortunate enough to have a little bit more space, and very fortunate in that regard. But I certainly do plan on returning.
Perfect. Okay. So you're just getting some open fresh air right now. I mean, a lot of people have gone to outside homes outside of Manhattan temporarily during COVID. So completely understandable, but you're heading back to the city. That's great to know, Hal. So, particularly being a native, what advice would you give to someone who is new to New York City and more so now due to this time?
Oh, I don't even know where to start on that one. uh,
Well, please just run off your list because we need it.
I think you're asking for yourself, and I think at this point, really just kind of enjoy the city the best that you can. Explore all of what New York has to offer in terms of events, culture, and obviously things have changed. Art, and there's just so many gems within New York City. To kind of find the best lists of food, things to do, and try to check off as much of that as possible.
Great, Hal. So there's something you touched upon earlier, and you mentioned the field you're in. You're a lawyer. So what I would love to do next, Hal, is get into our second segment and discuss a bit more about your legal background. And please let us know about it and what it entails and the clients you serve. Who do you help?
Very good question. So, I am a third generation attorney. I'm currently
Wow.
practicing at the law firm of Coopersmith and Coopersmith, which was founded
Hmm.
by my grandfather during the Great Depression. So,
Wow.
there's been a Coopersmith practicing in the island of Manhattan, New York real estate law for over 90 years. And,
Amazing.
very fortunate that we have a great infrastructure in place in terms of handling real estate law for our firm. We
Hmm.
handle a lot of commercial leasing, so a lot of office space,
Mm.
retail space, and showroom throughout New York City. So I was talking
Hmm.
about that and certainly have an inside view of that. And then we
Hmm.
do residential work as well. Those will be purchases and sales of residential properties. And I think you're going to ask me about residential leasing as well, which
Hmm.
I'm very excited to talk about a new platform that we developed for that.
Perfect. Yes. I love to know that, you guys have been three generations here in Manhattan. So you guys must know Manhattan inside and out. And you touched upon commercial real estate and residential. I feel, maybe a lot of the listeners that listen here are more residential, but commercial is going to be important for everyone and for New York. So you developed a platform. Tell us about the platform that you've developed, how to be able to help people.
Happy to do so. So, last year in New York State, and this is a statewide law, the legislature passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And what this does is it creates a lot more rights for tenants for residential leases in New York State.
Hmm.
And it's not to say that New York, or certainly New York City, was somewhat tenant friendly. This certainly shifts the balance to uh, tenants a lot more, and that's
Mm.
across the entire state. And there are a lot more requirements for residential landlords that they need to follow as a result of this new law. So,
Hmm.
what a landlord needs to do is that they need to send a non renewal or rent increase notice if they want to increase the rent by more than 5%. And they
Mm.
have to send that notice at a specified period of time, depending on
Hmm.
how long the tenant has been in the premises.
Mm. Hmm.
Then, if the tenant is going to leave or vacate, the landlord needs to offer the tenant a walkthrough within a 1 week window
Mm.
before the end of the lease.
Hmm.
And then the landlord needs to return the security deposit or provide an itemized list of damages within 2 weeks as well.
Mm.
And we'll represent landlords and tenants on the residential side. Same with the commercial side. But for our residential landlord, I saw that a lot of them wouldn't have the capabilities of complying with the law. That this law was passed. There are a lot more aspects to the law that what I discussed. It
Hmm.
includes, a credit check fee, a cap on the late fee,
Mm.
and what landlords can and can't do.
Hmm.
And but
Can I stop you there, Hal?
sure.
Thank you. You said a fee for applications and then a cap on late fees. Do you mind sharing those?
Sure. So a landlord can't charge more than $20 for a credit check fee. If you're
Mm.
renting in a condo or a co-op, the condo or co-op can charge higher fees, but
Mm.
a landlord themselves can't charge more than $20. And then if you pay your rent late, the late fee is capped at $50, regardless of uh, how much rent you pay. So
Mhm.
if you pay thousands of dollars in rent, the late fee is $50. If it's a lesser amount, the late fees capped at a certain percentage as well.
Perfect. And that goes for apartments and condo co-ops because I know there's a difference
Yes,
in those.
so the late fee's capped at $50, regardless of if it's a condo or a co-op. The
Mhm.
application fee, a condo or co-op can charge processing fees that are different than what a landlord can charge at this point.
Right. Okay. Thank you for letting us know that. Apologies on the interruption. So you were saying you developed something to essentially be able to help the landlords streamline, being aware of these processes. Please continue.
Yes. So, I saw that our landlords wouldn't be able to comply with the law, that they didn't
Hmm.
necessarily have that infrastructure in place, and that there wasn't software necessarily to do so, particularly for smaller landlords.
Hmm.
And so, what I developed was a platform called RezCue. That's RezCue, to
Perfect.
help landlords, managing agents, and residential real estate brokers comply with the law.
Hmm.
And for landlords, it lets them know about all the deadlines and what's coming up without having to consult a lawyer,
Hmm.
without trying to figure out what the changes to the law are.
Hmm.
And so ResQ sends out a sequence of email and text messages advising of all the obligations. And the email provides detailed instructions. The text message certainly just reminds the landlord, hey, check your email, because we all get all sorts of
Hmm.
emails these days, and the text message is a bit of redundancy.
Hmm.
And for managing agents and brokers, the software is wonderful because it can really strengthen the relationship with the landlord.
Hmm.
If you're a managing agent, you can have ResQ send out copies to the landlord who may not be attentive, so they know what's going on, and the managing agent and landlord can coordinate a lot quicker.
Hmm.
Same for brokers too.
Hmm.
Able to get these important team members on board
Hmm.
in terms of figuring out what you want to do with the tenant. How are you going to sell the apartment,
Hmm.
the building? What's the market like? And so, just having everyone on board all at once, was what I thought ResQ could solve.
Hmm.
It took a lot of work to complete that,
I'm sure.
but the hard work is, in terms of what I found, is not developing the software, it's
Mm.
getting people to actually use it. So that's been the
Mm.
phase
Hmm.
that I'm on, and the journey for the platform as well.
Oh my gosh, you shared so much great information, Hal. Thank you so much. So, on top of being a lawyer, you're an entrepreneur. You've developed this great platform that sounds like it's vital to landlords to really have, and it streamlines everything that's going to help them in the long run. Comply with the law and not get in any trouble. I love that. It seems like this platform just keeps you up to date on everything, and you wouldn't really need any outside. Anything else when you have this platform. Is that about right?
Well, there are different ways in terms of generating a lease and managing your rent roll, and a lot of different landlord software out there,
Mhm,
at least in terms of complying with the law and not having to necessarily consult a lawyer right
mhm,
away or monitor changes to the law.
mhm, mhm,
I don't think that there's anything out there beyond ResQ that's catered to smaller landlords, individual landlords, brokers, and managing agents.
okay, perfect. And so you mentioned it's a little hard right now. It wasn't developing the platform, but it's more so getting people to use the platform. And obviously, we're going through a time in New York where vacancies are really high, and there's probably a lot of stressors on landlords right now. So do you think that has to do with having to implement your product right now, or what do you think has been the difficulty there?
That's a good question. I'm still trying to figure that out day by day,
Hmm.
and I've had some wonderful conversations with landlords and brokers, and they see the value. I don't want to necessarily be too hard on myself
Hmm.
and say
Please
that,
don't. Hmm.
that that it's been extremely difficult. But people have signed on. I just, at least in terms of the difference between people who are interested
Hmm.
and people who do actually sign up, I've put in a lot of energy into speaking to people and then trying to get them to sign up. Seeing that difference is more what I'm talking about.
Okay. So just to define the product a bit more, so is it a SaaS based product? where it's like monthly thing, or is it just like an installation that then you have access to? And is it web-based platform or also app-based?
It's a very good question. So right now it's all web-based.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone can sign up at rezcueme.com. Again, that's RezCueme.com,
Mm-hmm.
and just enter in some simple lease information and contact information, email and cell phone, and RezCue takes care of the rest.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of figuring out where to go from there, I think there's a lot of possibilities that I am excited about,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what can be done once that information is on board, and maybe integrating with additional tenant management software that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, all it is web based.
Okay, perfect. And I love the name of it, RezCue, and you're literally going to the rescue for these landlords. So definitely something that I think landlords should check out. And I love the insight you gave us in regards to tenants. Is there any question or anything more that you would love to share with us in regards to rescue?
I think all I would love to share about RezCue is RezCue itself. So encourage anyone who's rented out property, who's a real estate broker, who's a managing agent, knows someone who has residential property in New York State, to start using the software.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're listening to this, if you know Mariana, or if you don't, feel free to reach out to me directly, and mention this podcast, and certainly able to work something out just by mentioning this podcast.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. There you go, guys. Reach out, okay? Be sure to reach out. In general, I love the product you've created, and I'm sure it's going to be thriving in no time. So, love that you're an entrepreneur and in law, Hal. On that sense, what inspired you to develop this app? And on top of that, you're also a podcaster.
I am a podcaster as well, a fellow podcaster. So what inspired me to develop RezCue
Mm-hmm.
was just reading the law, seeing how hard it was going to be for people to comply with the law, and seeing that in my own practice,
Mm-hmm.
and just realizing that it was a problem, and a problem that needed to be solved.
Mm-hmm.
And then being crazy enough to try to do something about that, which I think any entrepreneur is crazy enough to try to do.
Of course.
Uh, and then you also asked me about my podcast. I started the New York Launch Pod more than 5 years ago at this point,
Mm-hmm.
and there's certainly a lot of podcasts and a lot of growth in podcasting. But when I was in law school, I bought a new computer,
Mm-hmm.
and that computer came with an iPod Touch, which
Mm-hmm.
was an iPod of the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked at our college radio station,
Oh,
but
nice.
I was in the news department,
Mm-hmm.
not in the music department. And so when I discovered the podcast app on the iPod Touch,
Mm-hmm.
that's when I really fell in love with podcasts and the value that they could provide.
Mm-hmm.
And then with my radio background, just realizing, that I could even do a podcast myself,
Mm-hmm.
and learned about doing that. And so I wanted to create a podcast about New York businesses.
Amazing. So tell us about the plot of the podcast. So it entails talking to New York businesses.
Yes, exactly. So it's called the New York Launch Pod.
Mm-hmm.
I talk to startups, new businesses, openings. So that's kind of a broad brush for just having a New York based community and
Mm-hmm.
audience for what's happening in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and just talk about uh, you know what their business is, how they wanted to start their business, what motivated them, their challenges,
Mm-hmm.
and then what it's like doing business in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and with the benefits and the drawbacks, and some of the things that we talked about here on the personal side,
Mm-hmm.
but on the business side.
Oh, wow, I love that. And guys, I actually I'm learned of Hal through his podcast. I love his podcast. Definitely recommend it. Anything coming from Hal here at this point. So please be sure to tune into the New York Launch Pod. And Hal, so you're a lawyer, you're an entrepreneur, and you're a podcaster. What inspired you to do all this? Is there any type of books, podcasts that you listen to, people?
A lack of sleep is what inspired me to do all of this. I don't know. It's just kind of something that's inside that I wanted to do. I think that the journey of entrepreneurship is certainly a tricky one, and any entrepreneur will tell you that.
Mhm.
There are certainly benefits and drawbacks, but I think overall the good outweighs the negative. And even through everything, that's just kind of what you have to realize, because if you are an entrepreneur and are controlling your own destiny as opposed to someone else having a say in it, there's no better thing in terms of motivation, what to listen to, books, all sorts of things.
Mhm.
I've certainly had a long journey um, in that, and I'm always trying to consume
Mhm.
different items.
Mhm.
I've read books about law practice,
Mhm.
and listened to items about being a lawyer and having our own law firm. And thinking back to when I was listening to podcasts,
Mhm.
there weren't that many options out there,
Mhm.
and everything that I was listening to did inspire me one way or the other.
Mhm.
And just listening to the way the host
Mhm.
did different things
Mhm.
certainly inspired me. So what does that mean? I was listening to a fantasy football podcast. I was
Mhm.
listening to Bill Simmons.
Mhm.
I was listening to Planet Money.
Mm.
I was listening to a lot of NPR, and hearing those interviews, hearing how all those people were having fun in terms of what they were doing,
Mhm.
being educational. Way back when that inspired me and tried to incorporate different aspects into my own podcast. Now there are so many wonderful podcasts out there that you can find inspiration in a whole lot of different podcasts.
Gossipnista here. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to hop in here to ask that if you haven't yet, if you could please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen. This will help me reach more people and spread the word about New York City and those who love it. And if you want to stay up to date, be sure to follow @Gossipnista Podcast on Instagram. Now, back to the show. Now, you have a wealth of knowledge, and I really want to dive into that. So, in our third segment, I'd love to be able to ask some tips for the audience in regards to your background. And the first one being, what are some new laws that tenants should know about? I know you mentioned them earlier, maybe being able to repeat those or any additional things.
So on the tenant side, I think it's very important to know and understand the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. We talked about it from the obligations of the landlord side, but it certainly is designed to protect the
Mm-hmm.
tenants. Understanding the cap on late fees, on the credit check, and then the return of the security deposit. I think that actually, it's certainly burdensome or creates additional compliance obligations for the
Mm-hmm.
landlord. But on the tenant side, it's certainly tenant friendly. And I think back to my
Mm-hmm.
own experience as a tenant. I had a landlord who I actually asked for a walkthrough before this law, and this was years ago. They said that the apartment was clean and everything was all set. And then they deducted some money from my security deposit and said, the way that you left the apartment wasn't in the right condition. And I wanted to fight with them
Mm-hmm.
on that, but it didn't make sense to do that for
Mm-hmm.
that sum of money, to go through the court, to go through all the trouble. And so that aspect of the law and the return of the security deposit for tenants, I think is very important, because even as we were developing the software, one of the developers
Mm-hmm.
I was working with, his brother was in New York and actually didn't get the return of his security deposit while we were developing
Mm-hmm.
this software to help landlords comply with
Mm-hmm.
that obligation. So it just goes to show that that's still out there.
Wow. Okay. Is there any reason a landlord should not return a deposit to a tenant, right? Especially in today, nowadays, some people can't pay their rent and maybe they're leaving. Some people, and they had a deposit. You're obviously not going to get it then. Would that be the case? And just things along those lines.
That's a good question. So the security deposit is used to secure the payment of rent and performance under the lease. So if you haven't paid your rent, that's certainly a good reason for not receiving the return of the
Mhm.
security deposit. If there's damage to
Mhm.
the apartment or to the premises, certainly that's another reason why you wouldn't receive the return of your
Mhm.
security deposit. But or if there's been violations, or you've done something improper in the apartment, there are a lot of reasons why the security deposit wouldn't be returned. But if you've been a good tenant and you've returned the apartment or the house into
Mhm.
the condition that you originally got it, the law is absent reasonable wear and tear, because you are
Mhm.
actually living and using
Mhm.
the apartment, then you should receive the return of your security
But breaking
deposit.
a lease before the term is not going to get your deposit back whatsoever.
That's a very good question, Mariana. So, if you do break the lease, one of the aspects of the law is that there's an obligation for the landlord to mitigate their damages. And mitigate damages means try to prevent the loss of the lease. So, let's say, for example, your rent was
Mhm.
$1,000 a month, and you break your lease, then the landlord has to try to find someone that would pay $1,000 a month. And let's say they find a tenant that pays less, then the damages would be the difference between $1,000 a month and maybe a tenant who rents for
Mm.
$900 a month. But there's certainly an obligation now for a landlord to try to mitigate their
Mhm.
damages. And that's why you're seeing a lot of settlements in terms of lease breaks as a result of that aspect of the law.
Okay, so to get it straight, you unless the landlord finds a new tenant to replace you at the same value that you were in, you most likely won't get your deposit back.
At the same value, or maybe a little bit less, but in terms of calculating what those damages are, and that would come from the security deposit. But that's why it's the advice that we give, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, and there's going to be a lease break, you want to come to some form of settlement
Mm,
in terms of lease break overall before it does get messy, and do have to go through all those calculations, because it does get messy pretty quickly.
perfect. Good advice. Great. Thank you for answering that, Hal. Anything else you'd like to touch upon in regards to tenant laws or landlord laws before I ask the next question?
Mariana, there's a lot we could talk about, but I think it may be best if we moved on to the next question.
Great. So there's been a lot of changes in New York, right? Due to people working remotely, office buildings not being as full as they used to be, a lot more vacant. Can you give us some insight as to how it's out there in New York and your perspective on it being good or bad?
Well, that's a loaded question. I certainly think that it's not the way that it was, and the real estate industry through COVID-19, and particularly commercial real estate, is
Hmm.
hurting, and that's all throughout the news. And you are having a lot more unoccupied office space, whether it's just a fraction of the employees of the tenant working there, or just being completely vacant and everyone being remote.
Hmm.
And at least in terms of what I've seen and talked to our clients,
Hmm.
and been on Zoom panels about, that working from home is working, but there's a certain contingent that would prefer to be in the office,
Hmm.
and that entirely remote probably won't work. But
Hmm.
people are seeing the value of being able to work remotely, to not have to commute.
Hmm.
And so I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I do believe that offices will become occupied again. I
Hmm.
certainly believe in offices and the collaboration that can come with an office. And retail is certainly hurting when there's less density, and people are online shopping and trying to reposition what retail is, and what it means. And so I think that right now, at least in terms of real estate, it's a lot about surviving through current conditions, and then figuring out what the future looks like for if you're a tenant, your tenant's business, and if you're a landlord, what sort of tenant you want to attract to your property.
Right. Yep. Very much so. And thanks for sharing that. That's good to know. So almost like a 50-50 remote versus back in office, or we don't know that yet. But what you're saying is that it's not going to, going to be 100% remote.
I can't see a future where everyone is 100% remote and working at home. I think that it is
Mm-hmm.
possible, and we have figured out ways to collaborate remotely, which is wonderful and certainly flattened the ability for people to be in different parts of the country or the world and work together.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I do believe in offices. I do believe in collaboration, and maybe there'll be fewer commutes for me, or
Mm-hmm.
for other folks, and maybe are more open to virtual meetings as well.
Mm-hmm. And then, I try to keep up with the New York news as often as possible, as I'm sure a lot of people do, and you do. There's talks that, the prices in New York, the value of New York, they may, have to lower because of COVID. So do you see commercial buildings being a better value in the near future, not as expensive, as well as residential?
It's a good question. Certainly, rents are dropping, at least in
Mm-hmm.
the short term, and the value of a property is based off of what rent can be commanded. So, it's in at least in the short term, rents are dropping both on residential and commercial, obviously
Mm-hmm.
office and retail, and there's a lot of subleased inventory that's out
Mm-hmm.
there. But it's figuring out what the value is, and what, if you're in New York, why you're in New York, and what that means. And
Mm-hmm.
so part of the demand, in
Yeah.
terms of figuring out real estate, because the supply is there.
In regards to the supply, there's a lot of vacancies, whether it be business or offices and things along those lines. You do have a New York launch pod in regards to businesses and startups. Do you find this a good time and opportunity for businesses to potentially have a brick and mortar business in New York?
If someone wants to open a brick and mortar business, now is certainly the time. And if you ever thought about a retail store, or a retail presence, now is certainly the time.
Hmm.
Obviously, it's a function of figuring out what neighborhood and who's in the neighborhood, and why they're there, and what purpose that brick and mortar location would solve.
Hmm.
And so, and obviously, having a prediction in terms of when people return to New York and when density will return. So, so that's a big part of the business, but there is certainly a wonderful opportunity, and if you do have the wherewithal and are excited to be in New York, there's certainly a wonderful opportunity.
I love it. I love that you're saying there's opportunity and that now's a good time. Yes, we need to bring the city back to where it used to be. So, I mean, there's a lot of availability, whether it be, rent, residential, office space, and brick and mortars. So, is there anything, Hal, that maybe I may have missed or that you'd like to touch upon in regards to, your New York story, your career path, and RezCue, as well as any tips for the audience?
You certainly can't cover it all, but I think we covered a lot, and I think it's a wonderful note to end things on.
So, Hal, yes, you're 100% right. We can't cover it all, but you've done so amazing answering all these questions and giving us your expertise insight. So glad to have heard your New York story, learned about RezCue and your New York Launch Pod podcast. Thank you for your time, Hal. It's been a pleasure. We will talk soon.
Mariana, this has been wonderful. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Gossipnista. Your support means the world. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and share this podcast with your friends. Can't wait till next week's episode? Follow along on Instagram at Gossipnista to get my latest New York happenings. But if you live and breathe New York City like I do and want even more, go to our website at gossipnista.com, explore, and subscribe to our newsletter to get insider tips first. Lastly, if you have any questions and or scoop on the city, you can email me at gossipnista@gmail.com. Until next time, you know you love me. XOXO Gossipista.